George R.R. Martin is very good at writing tragedy, but not in the way you might expect. For him, it's rarely about a single moment. Instead, it tends to unfold slowly, through small decisions, shifting priorities, and the quiet ways a character changes under pressure. And Catelyn Stark, in my opinion, is the greatest example of that. Because her story isn't defined by the events themselves, it's defined by the way those events reshape her judgment. Again and again, what matters isn't just what happens to Catelyn, but how each moment changes what she values, what she fears, and how she chooses to act. Which brings us to the focus of this video, the point where that process really begins to take shape, Catelyn's third chapter in A Game of Thrones. Because the shift in her character doesn't begin with Bran's fall itself, it begins with everything that follows. Before I actually get into the chapter, let me clarify some context first. By the time this chapter opens, 8 days have passed since Bran's fall, and in that time, Catelyn hasn't moved. Her entire world has narrowed to Bran. The scene is quiet but not calm. Catelyn sits beside Bran fixating on small things, like how long his hair has grown, because her world has shrunk to almost nothing beyond him. But what's important about this is that she isn't thinking about Winterfell, or Ned, or what comes next. She's thinking about whether to move his bed closer to the window. When Maester Luwin comes in with the accounts, it almost feels like he stepped into the wrong place. He's talking about numbers, supplies, roles that need filling, the ordinary rhythm of a castle continuing on, and Catelyn just doesn't follow him there. She doesn't even attempt to look at the books. She just says, "I know what the visit cost us." And Luwin is obviously talking about food and coin and resources, but she isn't, because in her mind, the cost is already sitting in front of her. And from that point on, nothing else really registers. Luwin keeps trying, pointing out that they need a steward, a captain of the guards, someone to take over in the stables, and each time it feels more out of place than the last. Not even because he's wrong, but because those concerns belong to a version of Catelyn that just isn't here right now. When he mentions the Master of Horse, that's when she eventually just snaps. And it obviously isn't measured, it's just immediate. She says she would slaughter every horse in Winterfell herself if it would wake Bran, and it doesn't even sound like an exaggeration. It sounds like she's already weighed that exchange in her mind and accepted it. Everything else has been pushed aside. All that's left is Bran. Robb comes in partway through this, and what stands out isn't anything dramatic. He just takes over the conversation. Luwin is listing what needs to be done, and Robb looks at the list and says they'll deal with it tomorrow. It's simple, but it tells you something about how things are working in Winterfell now. Catelyn is still here, but she isn't really a part of it. When Luwin leaves, Robb turns to her, and his question, "What are you doing?" isn't really a question. It feels more like Robb trying to force her to recognize what she's become, because from his perspective, she hasn't just devoted herself to Bran, she's disappeared into him, withdrawing from everything else around her. He points out that she didn't even come to the gate when Ned and the girls left, and her answer is telling. She says she watched from the window, which is true but distant. It's the difference between being there and actually being present. Then Robb brings up Rickon, and this is where it becomes harder to ignore. Rickon doesn't understand what's happening. To him, people are just gone. And he responds the only way he can, by clinging to Robb, following him around, crying. Robb, who's already trying to manage everything else, and when he says, "I need you too," it doesn't come across as dramatic. It just sounds like he's reached a point where he can't do it alone. And it's very important to notice that Catelyn knows he's right. You can see it in how she reacts. But even then, she doesn't move. She can't, because leaving Bran, even for a moment, feels impossible. And then we get the scene where the wolves begin to howl, and something about that sound unsettles her immediately. It's described as cold and almost mournful, and the way she responds to it feels less like fear, and more like it's amplifying everything she's been holding in. She starts thinking about Bran, not just as he is now, but as he was, the child who climbed and laughed and imagined himself as a knight. and all of that feels gone. And the more the wolves howl, the more it builds, until she can't take it anymore. She covers her ears and shouts for it to stop, says they should be killed if that's what it takes. And it's a difficult moment because earlier she spoke about the horses the same way. Things that once had value, connections to her children, to the world around her, don't matter to her now. They've all been pushed aside. The grief has simplified everything down to something almost unbearable. And then the night is broken by shouts from outside the tower. The library is on fire. Robb reacts immediately, calling to the guards and heading out to deal with it, and Catelyn's response is very different. She looks out, sees the flames rising from the library, and her first thought is relief. Because Bran isn't in danger, and that's all that matters to her. The rest of it, the fire and the damage, barely registers, and it's in that moment while the castle is distracted that something else happens. When she turns back from the window, the man is already in the room, and everything changes very quickly. He wasn't supposed to find anyone there, that much is clear from what he says, and when Catelyn realizes what he's there to do, she doesn't freeze, she immediately resists. There's no time to think, just instinct. When he grabs her, when the knife is at her throat, she grabs the blade with both hands. Even as it cuts into her fingers, even as she's losing blood, she holds onto it, because letting go means Bran dies. While she fights him off, she bites into his hand, struggling in a way that feels completely instinctive. She's exhausted and half starved, and that unstable state makes her feel almost feral here. And just as the struggle seems to overwhelm her, the door opens and the wolf appears. Bran's wolf. It moves without hesitation. There's no struggle the way there was with Catelyn. It goes straight for his throat and ends it almost instantly. And when it's over, the room goes quiet again. The wolf stands there, looking at her, and there's something strange about that moment, because it feels deliberate. The kind of certainty that's been completely absent from everything Catelyn has done up until this point. When she thanks it, when it licks the blood from her hand, and then climbs up beside Bran, there's a sense that something has changed. And then she starts laughing, because it's too much. Everything at once, the fear, the relief, the shock, it all spills over. When they find her, she's still in that state, laughing and shaking while covered in blood. And after that she sleeps, for 4 days straight, which is the first real rest she's had since Bran fell. And when she wakes, there's a noticeable difference. The grief hasn't gone anywhere, but it's no longer overwhelming everything else. She remembers how she was before and feels ashamed, not in a dramatic sort of way, but her head just clears up. She knows she wasn't herself, she knows what she neglected, and she decides it won't happen again. Now this is the important part, because from that point on, the way she thinks changes. She starts asking questions, looking at what happened, not just reacting to it. The fire, the timing, the man hiding in the stables, the silver he was carrying, and then she realizes what it means. The fire wasn't random, it was obviously meant to draw people away, to leave Bran unprotected. And the man wasn't acting on his own. The dagger he carried is too fine for someone like him, which means it was given to him. And once she reaches that point, the conclusion follows. Bran wasn't meant to survive the fall, and now someone is trying to finish what they started. When she says, "I do not think Bran fell, I think he was thrown," it lands differently now, because it isn't coming from panic, it's coming from a place of thought. She's worked her way there. Now after that, everything becomes more focused. She pushes Robb to think through the implications. Why would someone want Bran dead? What could he have seen? What could he know? And once that line of thinking starts, it doesn't stop, because if someone tried to kill Bran, then Ned and her daughters may already be in danger. Which leads to the final decision. She chooses to go south, and what makes that significant isn't just the journey itself, it's that earlier in the chapter, Catelyn couldn't even bring herself to step away from Bran's bedside for a moment. Now, she's choosing to leave Winterfell entirely, because she finally understands that protecting Bran means doing more than simply staying beside him. At the start of this chapter, Catelyn is completely consumed by what's happened. Her world has narrowed to a single point. She can't think beyond it, she can't act beyond it. Everything else, her responsibilities, her other children, even herself, has fallen away. But what this chapter does is force her out of that. Not all at once, but step by step. The confrontation with Robb, the moment with the wolves, the attack, the sleep that follows. Each of these shifts something slightly until she reaches a point where she can see clearly again, and when she does, she doesn't go back to who she was before. She moves forward as someone more focused and more willing to act, but this new certainty is built on an assumption that the Lannisters are responsible, that Bran was pushed, that her family is actually in danger, and from here on, that belief is going to guide her decisions, whether it's right or not. Because that's how Martin writes tragedy, not as something sudden, but as something that grows out of choices like this one, where a character believes they understand what's happening and acts accordingly, and everything that follows comes from that.